Welcome to Gever Hakam, where the wise get wiser. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning about the third letter in the Hebrew alphabet. We're also going to learn a few key words, one of which is actually found in our key phrase here, Gever Hakam. Of course, we're also going to look at a few key verses, one from Proverbs and one from Jeremiah. So let's go ahead and learn some Hebrew. All right, well, we're going to be learning about the third letter, which is called the Gimel. But before we actually get into the letter, I did just want to mention something about why we're doing this again, just as an encouragement. Now, for all of us, I hope and would assume we're seeking to become more wise, people who have wisdom. But this is an important concept for us to consider as people studying the Bible, because we are not just seeking wisdom that is worldly or earthly or is human-made. We're actually seeking to be wise in the way that the Bible would lead us and want us to be. And one of the key things that's mentioned throughout Proverbs and connected throughout the rest of the Bible is that wisdom ultimately is not just about being successful or wealthy, especially not in this life, but about being properly aligned with God, properly aligned with ourselves and our character, our motivations, but also properly aligned with one another in the way we treat one another with justice and righteousness and consideration and love, commitment and faithfulness. And so to be truly wise is not just about gaining information. It's about becoming a different kind of person, a person who reflects the very nature and ways of God. And according to the Bible, and I would say especially in Proverbs, that's what it means to be wise. So I hope you'll think about that as you learn Hebrew, again, to study the Bible, to become something more, something different than we were. And hopefully that will be a little bit more like God, loving others and sacrificing even our own wants and desires for the good of others. That's the way of the Lord. All right, well, we can talk about the letter here now. So before we get into the letter Gimel, I do want us to go through the alphabet. So we're going to go through the whole alphabet together. And you can follow along. Again, I would recommend grabbing a piece of paper and a pen and writing these out, practicing. And perhaps you can even try to go through this without the help. Perhaps by now it's starting to become a little more familiar. So let's go ahead and do the alphabet. We have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ein, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that's the whole alphabet all together. So let's learn those just a little bit slower. So again, we have Aleph, Aleph, Bet, Bet, Gimel, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet, He, He, Vav, Vav, Zayin, Zayin, Chet, Chet, Tet, Tet, Yod, Yod, Kaf, Kaf, Lamed, Lamed, Mem, Mem, Nun, Nun, Samek, Samek, Ein, Ein, Pe, Pe, Tzade, Tzade, Kof, Kof, Resh, Resh, Sin, Sin, Sheen. Sheen. Tav. Tav. All right. Well, that's our alphabet once again. So let's do a little more quickly all together here. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, hopefully that's starting to feel a little bit more familiar. Well, let's talk a little bit about Gimel. Gimel, which is our third letter. The third letter, Gimel. Gimel. So how do we write it? What does it look like? What are some key features to consider for this letter? Well, if you're going to write it out, you should first think about it as a diagonal line that reaches from the top, right, of the line space to the bottom of the line space, as we see here. And then second line or stroke will be this kind of diagonal cut right here. It's sort of in the middle. It might be a little bit below the middle, actually. Kind of depends on the font and how it's written, but somewhere towards the middle or maybe 2/3 down the way. And this ends up being the Gimel. So one stroke down, another stroke to the side. And that's our Gimel. That's how you write it. All right, so hopefully you can practice that. Maybe even pause and do it a few times, get a feel for it. We can also look at some different fonts, some different ways that it's written or that you'll see it. So, of course, the font that we saw here, this is a bit more fancy, the style that you'll probably see in like the Hebrew Bible and things like that. But there are some more simplified versions, as you see here. And so in this one, it's a little less of a diagonal line and almost more like a little bit of a curved line with a leg sticking out the side there. We can see another more simplified version here. Again, it still has the same basic form, but there are a few things you want to pay attention to with these different types of fonts. All right, now we can actually briefly discuss the history of it. So in our earliest times, the Proto-Sinaitic, we actually see that this was basically what we would think of as like a modern L, right? Capital L, as it's written here. And remember, this is from about the time of the Judges to perhaps Abraham. What's interesting, though, is during the Paleo-Hebrew period, it actually kind of flipped upside down, as you see here. And now it's kind of that same shape, but it's from the top instead. So the top and then down. And this is during that period of basically the monarchy or the king's period of Israel's history. Now, what's really interesting is that actually in ancient Greece or ancient Greek, which was presumably started maybe around 800 BC. It's hard to say, maybe 700 to 900, somewhere in there. But it was actually built off of the Phoenician or the Paleo-Hebrew script. So as you can see here, this is the exact same as our Paleo-Hebrew. It's just backwards, right? And that's because Greek was written from left to right, just like English and Latin and so on. But Hebrew was written from right to left. So they are just mirror images of one another. And so, as you can see, it developed from sort of this L type shape to an upside down version, but from right to left. And then it kind of switched over for the modern or the Greek to Latin forms. All right. Well, let's look at or think about some other features of the language or the word, the letter. So the Gimel is the G sound, the G sound. Now, what's important for us as English speakers is to know that it's the G as in good, okay? Not as in giraffe or George, right? It's the G sound. So in ancient times, they presumably didn't have that J sound. That's a more modern, and I think maybe from Germanic, I'm not sure. But in any case, the original sound was the G sound, as in good. Now, you'll also notice that this letter has both a doggish form with the dot and a form without the doggish, right? Now, we saw that with the bet, but what's a little different about the Gimel is that in at least modern times, we do not pronounce these differently. These have the same sound. So with the doggish and without the doggish, they're both just the G sound. However, if you remember, the bet did have a different sound. That one was B versus the V sound. So this might feel a little bit confusing, or maybe like, well, why are we doing it? Well, the reality is probably in ancient times there was a little bit of a distinction in sound. So maybe this was a bit more of a G sound, and this was probably a bit more of like a G sound, kind of like a GH, like ghost or something. But again, in any case, in modern times, it's pronounced the same. Also, we can mention here that the Gimel is used as the number 3, particularly in later Hebrew. So for Genesis 3, it would have been Bereshit Gimel, right? And so that would have indicated Genesis chapter 3. All right, well, let's look at a few key words. So the first one here is the word Gever. Gever. And Gever is a word that can just mean man, but it typically carries the sense of something more like a strong person or a mighty man. Now, it doesn't have to mean that, but it does seem to carry that sense a little bit more than just a mere man. And that's because there is a word for simply a man, and that's Ish, right? There's also another one, Adam, right? Or Adam. So this is a third word for man, and that's why it oftentimes gets used a little bit more in the sense of a strong man or a mighty man. And of course, like I mentioned, this is actually the word used in our phrase, Gever Hakam. And we'll talk about that in our verse from Proverbs. All right, now 2 more helpful words here are related or similar. So we have the word gadol, gadol, and we have gadal, gadal. So gadol, gadal. So the one over here, gadol, is our adjective, which means something like large or big. So if you were to say, the large man, right, it would be gadol. The large horse or animal, right, gadol. However, gadal is the verb, which means something like to become big or to grow up. So it's often used in the sense of a child becoming an adult, right? Becoming bigger. And so he grew up. Gadal. All right, well, here's an interesting, maybe more fun word. And this is the word gamal. Gamal. And gamal is the word for camel. So it actually sounds very similar. And I would imagine that our word camel probably came directly from this earlier either Hebrew or a related form. So gamal means camel. All right, and then we have the word goral. So we have go, ral, go, ral, goral. And goral is that word that gets used in the sense of lots, so to like cast lots. And this is sometimes used to make decisions that are difficult or uncertain. And in ancient times, they typically believed that you would do this and sort of pray and ask the Lord to give you the answer. And this was one of the ways that they would determine the will of the Lord. is they would throw these lots, maybe something like dice or some other kind of, some other thing that was used, maybe rocks, like a number of rocks and how they were positioned. We don't know for sure exactly how they worked, but we could presume it's something like dice. All right, so goral, lots. All right, and then here's another interesting and important word that gets used throughout the Old Testament Hebrew Bible in really important, interesting ways, but even carries over at least an idea and concept to the New Testament. So this is the words ger, 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 and gar, gar, or gur. So ger is the word for an alien or a traveler, a temporary resident, somebody who's just kind of either they're not in their home country, they're not in their hometown, their home place, right? They're traveling, they've immigrated, and so Abraham was a ger when he went into the land which is now known as Israel, and there are many other instances where people were called ger. And there was even special laws given and expectations given for the ger, right? That Israel was supposed to treat them with a high level of respect and honor and not to mistreat them. So gar, or sometimes pronounced gur with an u sound in here, is the verb, which means to travel or to wander or to pass through, right? So to wander into another land. All right, well, let's get into our verses. So we're going to be looking at Proverbs 24, verse 5. 24, verse 5. And this is actually where we get the phrase Gever Hakam. Gever Hakam. And you can see it right here in the beginning of our phrase, in our verse. So we have the word Gever, 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 Hakam, Hakam, Baos, Baos. So we have Gever Hakam Baos. And this means a wise man in strength, or in his strength, or in the strength. And you'll notice here that I put in parentheses increases. And that's because we'll see in the second part of the verse that is where we actually get the verb. But while we're still here, we can mention that this is a little phrase here, Gever Hakam, a wise man or a wise person. And then ba, if you remember, is that preposition we learned. Be, in, with, by, among. And so here probably means something like in, or perhaps with, strength, right? And os is the word for strength or might. All right, so then we can look at the second half of the verse. So we have the ish, the at, the ish, da, at, the ish, da at, the ish, da at. And this means and the ish da'at, man of knowledge, right? Or a knowledgeable man. So you can see how this is paralleled with our previous phrase, right? A wise man, or a man of wisdom, and then a man of knowledge or understanding. Okay, so we have a wise man in his strength and a man of knowledge. Me'ametz, koach. Me'ametz, koach. So the meh here is something that we won't learn for a while, but it's a part of a type of verb, which makes it sort of in the sense of like one who does something, right? So amatz is to increase or to develop. And so this would be something like one who develops or grows or increases in koach, which is strength or power. So you can see that we have several parallels here, right? So koach parallels with oz. We have ishtat parallels with Gever Hakam. So this me'ametz in this kind of poetic short proverb serves as the verb for both parts of the verse. So we can say that a man of knowledge increases in power, and we can also say that a man of wisdom increases in strength. Again, kind of saying the same thing, and you'll find that that's very common in Hebrew poetry. And they typically parallel two things and say the same thing, but in kind of different ways or with different words. So all that to say that a wise man will increase in his strength and his power, and a man of knowledge also will increase in strength. And of course, we know that ultimately our strength and our power and our refuge is in the Lord. And as I had mentioned before, that truly being wise and growing in wisdom is really related to knowing and imitating and becoming like God in his ways and knowing him. And this is kind of mentioned in Proverbs 2:5, right? And that there's a correlation or connection between fearing the Lord and knowing the Lord, growing in our wisdom, seeking wisdom, and finding the knowledge of God. And so these are related, and this is a very interesting and important verse, even though it's found in this kind of remote part of Proverbs. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at our next verse from Jeremiah 10. Jeremiah 10. So in Jeremiah 10 here, we see the phrase Ein ka mo ka Adonai. Ein ka mo ka Adonai. And so with phrases here, we have Ein means there is not, or there is none. Ein, there is not, there is none. And then we have ka mo ka. And so you'll notice that ka is added to the end, and it actually means you, and sometimes like your, but in this case, you. And then so the word kamo is the word here like. There's a couple different ways you could say this. You could simply just say ka, but because of this phrase, it becomes ka mo ka, like you. So this is a somewhat common phrase. Ka mo ka, like you, and then of course the name of the Lord, Yahweh, Adonai, the Lord. All right, so let's look at the next part of this verse. So we have a word we just learned, gadol. Gadol. Ata. Ata. The gadol. The gadol. So we have gadol ata the gadol. All right. So gadol means big or large, right? Good. All right. So large or big, gadol. And then ata is actually our pronoun meaning you. So in our previous verse, we saw that ka, or part of the verse, we saw ka can mean you. But as you notice here, it's attached to a word at the end, which is a very common pattern. But ata is when you have the pronouns separate. And again, we'll talk about the grammar and things like that more in depth later on. But you can probably learn and pick up on some of the stuff as we go. So this is a little phrase that means, great are you, ata, gadol ata. So you are great, of course, meaning big or majestic. And then the gadol, and great, we have to go to the next part of the verse. Shimka, 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 Big Vura, Big Vura, Shimka, Big Vura, Shimka, Big Vura. All right. So the words here we have are Shim, Shim, which is that word for name. And as we saw again just previously, that Ka means you or your. So here it would means your name, your name. And then we have Big Vura, and Gabur or Gibura means mighty. So this looks a little bit different and perhaps sounds a little different, but if you remember, this is actually the very similar word or related word to Gever. So like I said, Gever means man, but it is often related to power or might or greatness. And so we actually see that here, that this word Gevur or Gibura is the word for mighty or greatness. And so Shimka, and then in greatness, your name in greatness. So this is kind of split up here, but we actually have great is your name, or excuse me, you are great, or great are you, and great is your name in power or mightiness. And so we have this great sort of praise of the Lord, reflecting on his name. Now, it might seem a little weird to say how great someone's name is. You don't normally just say like, oh, how great the name of Bob is, or oh, how great the name of, Joanna or something, right? And that's because we oftentimes don't think about names in the same way as the ancient people did. So in ancient times, names had a much more significant meaning and value to them. And this was extremely important and true about the name of the Lord, which is why it was very important not to mishandle it. Sometimes stated to not take it in vain, but really what it means is to not make it little or less than what it really is, and to try and twist it and use it for your own self-gain. But to honor it. And that's because the name of the Lord, as we hear about in Exodus 34, actually communicates something really important about God. It's his character, right? That he is gracious and merciful and abounding in steadfast covenant love, but also full of justice, right? Repaying evil and sin with judgment, right? And so, it is often found in the Psalms and even many of the prophets that the name of the Lord is exalted. And that's because it's kind of a short way, an honorific way of saying all that the Lord is, all that the Lord does is great and good, because he has a name that is perfect, meaning his being, his character, right? Who he is. And so it's more than just letters. It's more than just some title of some sort, but it's really about who he is. And so we see this highlighted in Jeremiah. All right, well, let's go ahead and finish up the letter Gimel with our alphabet. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, well, that is the letter Gimel. So again, I hope you learned something, and I hope you'll share something, and most importantly, I hope that you will seek to be wise in the way that the Bible says to be wise. Love the Lord and love others.